welcome to the new podcast, which is Guts and Glory, the American Revolution. Okay, so, introduction, origins of a rebellion. 3 millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, the invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Patrick Henry, March 23rd, 1775. What if I told you that the story about George Washington cutting down a cherry tree is total crap, and that once G.W. swore at a dude so much that the entire Continental Army stopped running away and turned to face a British bayonet charge? And what if I told you that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, and the guy on the nickel, had a panic attack when he found out he was supposed to write the Declaration of Independence? Seriously, Ben Franklin and John Adams had to chase him into a bar and drink beers with him until he finally decided, okay, yeah, I'll write a letter to the dang King of England telling him to suck lemons. Did you know that Andrew Jackson, the man on the $20 bill, joined the army at the age of 13, was captured by the British, and was so disrespectful to the officer who captured him that the dude chopped part of Jackson's hand off with a sword? Oh yeah, and what if I told you the greatest war hero of the American Revolution ended up turning traitor and joining the British? Now we have 3 monuments in his honor in the United States, but he's so hated that none of them actually mention his name. The American Revolution is, without question, the single most important event in American history. It was the longest war the U.S. has ever fought. It killed 1% of the American population, which might not sound like much, but it's a really big number of people, and it altered the course of human history forever. Victory in the American Revolution set up the first democracy in the modern world. You know, the system of government where people actually get to vote for things. And it marked the end of the old days when the king or the queen basically forced the rural subjects to do whatever he or she wanted. Now, there were a lot of things going on that led to the war between America and Great Britain, but the short version is that the Americans didn't want to pay taxes to the British king. So they pulled out a bunch of guns and started threatening government officials. The British didn't back down because they felt like the American colonies should pay taxes, and then all heck broke loose. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Let's back up 160 years or so to when the English first came to America. As much as the director of your school Thanksgiving play loves to talk about pilgrims and Plymouth Rock and eating giant turkeys stuffed with cranberry sauce and bacon, the first English settlement in the New World was actually at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. 13 years later, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock and started baking candied yams, and then over the next 100 years or so, more and more English settlements started popping up all over the place, from Rhode Island to Georgia. Eventually, America was divided into 13 colonies, each with its own governor. Connecticut, Delaware, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Present-day Vermont was part of New Hampshire, and Maine was part of Massachusetts. People living in the colonies were considered British subjects, under the rule of the King of England and the protection of the British Army, and laws were made by the King and the British Parliament, which is like their version of our present-day Congress. America was a good place for people from England to go over to live because England was super crowded and really expensive. Over in America, there was a ton of cheap land that people could buy for farming or ranching or whatever. When your options are work in a horrible factory or at a smelly dock for little money in England, or own a couple of acres of land and sit on your back porch in the middle of nowhere in America, many people chose to travel across the Atlantic Ocean and try to build a new life. The only thing you really had to worry about in North America was that occasionally a bunch of American Indians would come to try and kill you because you were technically stealing their land. But most colonial villages set up groups called militias, which were neighborhood armies, like a cross between a volunteer fire department and the U.S. Army National Guard Infantry Battalion. England wasn't the only European country that had colonists living in America. The British soldiers were basically just the east coast of the modern-day United States. Florida, Texas, and Mexico, and most of South America were held by Spain, and the French colonists lived in Quebec, Canada, and on a humongous chunk of land just west of the Appalachian Mountains. This territory was called Louisiana, but it actually stretched from New Orleans all the way up to Detroit and was way bigger than the current state of Louisiana. As you might imagine, England, France, and Spain all occupying North America at the same time eventually caused problems, and before long there was a huge war. The fight actually started in Europe and had literally nothing to do with America. In 1756, Queen Maria Theresa of Austria went to war with the German state of Prussia over a little chunk of land called Silesia. Austria and Prussia called their buddies to help them, and before long you had an epic war with Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and France on one side, and Prussia, Great Britain, and Portugal on the other. A lot of those countries had colonies that bordered each other in other parts of the world too. So then you had guys fighting in India, the Caribbean, North America, and anywhere else. In Europe, people referred to this humongous world war as the 7 Years' War, but in America, we call our part in it the French and Indian War, because it was actually lasted only 4 years. And over here, the British colonists were fighting against the French and American Indians. This makes it easier to keep track of. The details of the French and Indian War could make a whole other book, but here's the deal. The British Army came to America and kicked France's booty, beating them up and down the Mississippi and Canada. Then, over in Europe, the British Royal Navy smoked the French Navy into burning cinders, blasting apart their ships, crippling their sea power for decades, and making it really hard for them to bring fresh troops across the ocean. The American colonists contributed their small groups of militia soldiers to the British cause, but the colonists had very little formal military training and zero experience fighting as regular infantry. So for the most part, these farmer soldiers ran away every time they had to fight actual French army forces. This cheesed off the British a little, and eventually they stopped using colonial militias to help them fight in important battles. The French and Indian War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which basically kicked the French out of North America once and for all. All French holdings in Canada went to England. All French holdings along the Mississippi went to Spain. Florida became a British colony, and England also took territory in India and the Caribbean from the French. It was a crushing victory. Well, for all the glory and heroism and butt-kicking, England... Okay, give me a second, I lost the page again. Well, for all the glory and heroism and butt-kicking, England ended the war with a little bit of a problem. Wars are really expensive and require a ton of money to pay soldiers and keep them fighting. So the British figured they'd just basically fought a big war in America to protect the American colonists from the French and the American Indians. The American colonists should cough up some taxes to help, actually pay for it. On the surface, this might make sense, but there's a problem. America didn't have any seats in the British Parliament, so the colonists felt like they were stuck doing whatever England decided they should do. The Americans didn't have a single vote in the matter, and now they were gonna be forced to pay all this money to the king over a war they didn't start, and that took place mostly on another continent. This made some folks in the colonies a little super righteously, furiously angry. We'll see how that plays out in Chapter 1. When war finally broke out between the American colonists and Great Britain, each side had very distinct advantages and disadvantages. Great Britain. In 1775, Great Britain was the single most powerful country in the world. The British Empire was made up of England, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Grenada, and Barbados, as well as parts of Africa and India and even China. And it stretched across every continent on Earth, even Antarctica. It consisted of millions of people and had a nearly limitless supply of money coming in. It had the largest, best trained, and most powerful navy in the world, and an army that had proved itself over time after time on the battlefield. The British hadn't lost a single war in over 100 years, and they had hardly lost a single battle in the 7 Years' War. Of course, for a war in America, they would need to transport everything 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they would need to keep resources available to defend their holdings in Africa, India, the Caribbean, and even back home in England. There were a lot of angry countries, particularly France and Spain, that were just looking for an opportunity to shank the English in the back while they were focusing on a war with the American colonists, the American colonies. In the early years of the Revolution, America had no formal government, no army, no navy, and very few actual cities. Despite having a gigantic chunk of land, America actually had like half as many people living in it as there were in England, meaning that America had far fewer soldiers to throw into combat. The Americans also had no formal currency, no way to pay for things, and few experienced military commanders. They had fought poorly in the French and Indian War, and no American force had proved it could stand toe-to-toe with a European army on the battlefield. Even worse, the country was divided among three distinct groups of people. The patriots, guys who were actively fighting in the rebellion, the loyalists, people who were actively fighting on the side of the British because they didn't want to break away from the British Empire, and people who refused to fight for either side. Still, despite this division and all these drawbacks, the Americans had a few advantages. They were fighting on their home turf, and they knew the roads and the land, and they believed in the cause, and home field advantage can make all the difference. The World in 1776. This book is going to focus on events that took place in North America, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk a little bit about what was going on in the rest of the world in 1776. Sure, when you look at old-school paintings of people from the 1700s, they all look pretty chill. But in reality, the world was a messed up place filled with secret political dealings, powerful personalities, and tons of crazy drama. Western Europe was the dominant power in the world at this time, and every country on the European continent was working hard to build large military and trade empires stretching across the globe. Think of it like an epic real-life version of Civ. They were constantly switching alliances and backstabbing each other for their own gain. It was a brutal, double-crossing world full of wars, assassinations, spies, and deceit, ruled by the might of King George III. England was the primary power in Europe, having just come out on top of the 7 Years' War. Scotland was technically its own country, connected to England by something called the Acts of Union. So while they still had to do what the English king in Parliament told them, the Scots also had a bunch of seats in the Parliament, so it wasn't like they didn't get a vote. The setup is kind of what the Americans were hoping for when they first started the Revolution. Ireland was also connected to England, although a lot of our Irish people were unhappy about this. Together, Scotland, Wales, and England made up Great Britain, which was the union of all three countries under the power of King George III. Yes, it's just as confusing as it sounds, and to make it worse, I'm mostly going to use England and Great Britain to mean pretty much the empire, included huge chunks of land in North America, the American colonies, the Caribbean, Africa, and India, meaning the King of England had a lot of power and control in those countries too. In England, Edward Gibbon had just published the first volume of his massive epic, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Intrepid explorer James Cook was setting out on his final voyage, the one where he became the first European to set foot on the Hawaiian Islands, and shortly thereafter became the first European to be killed by a Hawaiian warrior. Scottish economist Adam Smith had published the Rule Book for Capitalism, The Wealth of Nations, and inventor James Watt had just refined the steam engine, an invention that changed the world forever and helped kickstart a period known as the Industrial Revolution. Another noteworthy invention arrived around this time as well, when Scotsman Alexander Cummings invented a key component of what would eventually become the modern flush toilet. Sure, you laugh, but think about where we'd be without that one. France was in its second year of the reign of King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, and they were the last king and queen of France, and they were overthrown and publicly beheaded by their subjects a few years after the American Revolution. France had been considered the largest and most powerful army in Europe, but had recently been humbled by the butt-kicking it received in the 7 Years' War. France was now desperately trying to rebuild its shattered remnants of its army and navy. It still held Haiti, known as Saint Domingue at the time, Saint Lucia, Martinique, and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, but had lost most of its holdings in India and all of its lands in America. France desperately wanted to avenge its honor against England, but didn't have the means to do so. Within the country, writers of the French Enlightenment, such as Voltaire and Diderot, were publishing words saying that individual freedom, equality, science, and reason should replace the old way of kings and the Catholic Church, which dominated every aspect of people's lives. These authors' works were read extensively by the American founding fathers, who had tried to apply them to the Revolution. Spain was ruled by King Carlos III, who was actually a cousin of the French King Louis XVI. Carlos was an enlightened, intelligent leader who tried to improve his country, encouraging the works of influential artists such as Francisco Goya. But it was clear that the once mighty empire of Spain was now in decline. It still held Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and huge parts of South America, but Spanish subjects in those regions were getting cranky. Spain was also expanding into the California territory, having just established the towns of San Francisco and Tucson in 1776. There was a lot of unrest in those territories, though primarily from the native peoples in Mexico and South America. The idea of a rebellious North American colonies overthrowing the English king was terrifying to the Spanish crown. Other European powers were working on their colonies as well. Portugal had colonized Brazil and many territories on the west coast of Africa, and the expert trading and merchant kingdom of the Netherlands held St. Eustatius in the Caribbean, as well as Cape Colony, South Africa, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, and parts of what is now Malaysia. Neither Germany nor Italy existed as a country at that time. They were both just big messes of little countries and states that sort of spoke the same language. The most powerful German state was Prussia, which had won amazing victories under its king, Frederick the Great, in the 7 Years' War. Afterward, many of these German states, particularly Hesse-Kassel, offered to lend their highly experienced armies to the highest bidder. These hired soldiers were called mercenaries, and England bought tens of thousands of Hesse-Kassel soldiers to help in the war against America, which made the Americans very mad. Austria was in the 26th year of its reign of Queen Maria Theresa, Queen of Austria, Hungary, and Croatia. Maria was the mother of the French Queen, Marie Antoinette, and the two countries were in an alliance at the moment. Many people in Maria Theresa's kingdom were reading the works of the best-selling German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and they were flocking to packed concert halls to hear the music of Joseph Haydn and the up-and-coming 20-year-old composer named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Poland was in trouble in 1776. 4 years earlier, it had been pressured into the first partition of Poland, which basically the entire country was divided up among Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The Polish tried to resist, primarily under the leadership of a heroic nobleman named Casimir Pulaski, but the rebellion was crushed. The once proud Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was at the mercy of its neighbors. Russia, meanwhile, was doing the best it had done in decades. The powerful Empress Catherine the Great was in charge, with her armies commanded by a military genius, Alexander Suvorov. Russia had won huge victories against Poland and the Ottoman Turkish Empire in recent years. It was also modernizing its army, building a navy, and trying to get rid of slavery, and had recently taken huge chunks of Ukraine and Crimea from Turkish control. The Ottoman Turks, under Sultan Abdul Hamid I, the first controlled Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and pretty much all the Middle East. But this was another empire in slow decline. The Turks' defeat by the Russians in 1774 was humiliating. And rebellious in several Middle Eastern provinces were causing more and more people for the Sultan, who was bravely maintaining control of his empire. Farther south, Iran, which was called Persia until 1935, was controlled by the Zand dynasty. 20 years before, Persia had been run by the great conqueror Nader Shah, a brutal military dictator who ideologized Genghis Khan and exterminated rivals across the Middle East and India. With Nader Shah's fall in 1747, his empire pretty much fell apart immediately. It was taken over by one of his top generals, Karim Khan. But after his death, the empire involved into fighting and bickering and broke apart completely. India was being hit hard by the Europeans in 1776, particularly the forces of the British East India Company. England had forcibly taken control of many port cities in India and was now making tons and tons of cash by sending exotic spices and other items back to Europe. France and Holland had tried to break into the market, but England fought them off and kept its vice grip on the world's most expensive resources. The rest of the Indian subcontinent was technically divided between the crumbling Muslim Mughal Empire and the Hindu Maratha Empire, but neither lasted long against the might of the British Empire. China had over 13 million square miles of territory and over 300 million people, and was ruled by the Qianlong Empire of the Qing dynasty. In 1776, China was one of the largest, richest, and most culturally advanced civilizations in the world. The empire was promoting literature and culture and was building epic Buddhist temples and the largest library in the world. He also ruthlessly exterminated his enemies in Mongolia, Tibet, and Burma in a series of military conquests known as the 10 Great Campaigns. Japan was in the 173rd year of the Tokugawa shogunate government. Under the rule of Emperor Go-Momozono and Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan was in the era of peaceful eternity, part of a long-running golden age of tranquility that had begun back in 1615. But Japan had sealed its borders against all foreigners and did not permit trade or outside visitors at all. Author's note: my fifth great-grandfather, Thomas Jennings, 1746 to 1812, came to the colony of Virginia as an indentured servant at the age of 13. By 1776, he was 30 years old, 5 years younger than I am now, and he already owned his own farm in Spotsylvania County. He had just married a woman named Sarah Carter, but when the call came for soldiers to fight for American freedom, Jennings left his family and his home, enlisted in the army, and served throughout the war as a rifleman in Captain John Herndon's company of the Virginia Militia. I don't have a list of engagements he served in, but in addition to fighting as a soldier, he also, according to the documentation I have, supplied beef. I had no idea what that means, but I like to envision him totally jacked arms and punching people while saying, "Here comes the beef." Even though this war was fought 241 years ago, the American Revolution seems to follow me around pretty much everywhere I go. I was born in downtown Philadelphia, 2 blocks away from the Liberty Bell. I was named after my great-grandfather, who was named after Benjamin Franklin. My dad used to have a brown Bess and Pennsylvania rifle hanging on the wall of our living room, right next to a portrait of George Washington, and my pops used to impress his friends at parties because I could identify all 3 things by name when I was still a baby. He also did his senior history thesis at the University of Virginia on British Lieutenant Colonel Banastra Tarleton, a guy I'll talk about in detail in Chapter 19. Tarleton almost succeeded in kidnapping Thomas Jefferson, who founded the University of Virginia, so I don't know what this says about Dad's school spirit. I can do the Patrick Henry "give me liberty or give me death" speech from memory because my mom would recite it every time my brother and I were driving her completely crazy. At first, my grown-up job, working as a file clerk in some tiny Massachusetts law firm, I could look out the window of my cubicle and see the spot where the Boston Massacre went down. I once played in a softball game in the park across the street from the Bunker Hill Monument. I've walked the streets of Colonial Williamsburg, accidentally discovered the battlefield at Cowpens while searching for a gas station, visited the Declaration of Independence in Washington, D.C., and walked the parapets of Fort Independence in Massachusetts Bay. Heck, I've reenacted battles from the Revolutionary War, fired a flintlock musket, and felt the weight of a loaded powder box on my shoulder. I have an exact replica of Lord Cornwallis's red army coat hanging in my closet right now, and every time I'm too lazy to think of a good Halloween costume, I slap that together with a powdered wig, some dark makeup, and a tricorn hat, and go as Zombie Cornwallis. As you might imagine, this costume sometimes requires a little explaining. What I'm saying is that for me this stuff isn't just ancient history buried in the pages of a dusty textbook so boring it can be used as a form of torture. The American Revolution is part of every single aspect of our lives, whether you're voting for a class president, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, signing a petition, or handing a cashier a $10 bill. You can still see leftovers of the American Revolution in street names, monuments, money, and statues all over the United States, and in TV shows like Turn and video games like Assassin's Creed 3 and Fallout 4. And as much as 1776 feels like an eternity ago, think about this for a minute. America has been a country for just over 240 years. When we became a nation, Great Britain existed for more than 700 years. Before that, the Romans were around for over 1,000 years, and the Chinese emperors reigned for more than 2,000. America is a blip of the timeline of world history, and the Revolution was not as long ago as you might think. With this book, I wanted to tell the story of the American Revolution from beginning to end, highlighting white-knuckled acts of incredible bravery, from epic battles to sword-swinging mayhem, to fearless spy missions to high-octane bayonet charges. But I also wanted to highlight the heroism of progressive thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and many others who were trying to figure out a brand new system of government that had never been successfully tried before. There are some stories you'll know and others that I bet will surprise you. Either way, it's going to be a heck of a journey from the roiderous streets of Boston to the blood-stained shores of Yorktown to the very beginning of the country that we are lucky to live in today. All right, let's do this.